Hello, everyone. We're back with the second part of our Copilot and Azure data series, and we're back with Someleze. So in the previous episode, which you haven't seen, you should see, we got a lay of the land of Azure Data Factory, which was a pretty cool product, learned how to understand a query that is existing that you might have inherited, but more importantly, how to modify it to actually be able to do useful things with it. So now, Someleze is going to show us how we make new queries, but also how do you add synthetic data, which is a big topic because sometimes we just don't have enough good data to be able to rationalize over and make choices. So synthetic data becomes a big factor in our overall end-to-end data story. Someleze, thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks, Dona.
Of
So
course.
happy to be here and showcase the awesomeness of Copilot.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Yeah, so right off the bat, we're about to create a new query. Firstly, that new query is just going to use already existing data, just doing a little amount of transformation. And then we're going to create another query that uses synthetic data that's generated within the data flow. Okay, let's actually do this. So in our requirements for this specific data set, we're actually trying to look at the revenue generated by each store, and we actually have some columns that showcase the store name within our sales query. But we want to actually keep it separate to create it as its own table to have unique values. And how do we do this? So I already have a prompt. I'm going to ask our friend Copilot to actually do this for us. And I'm going to put it in here and say, hey, I'm going to ask it and say, hey, create a new query and select only store key and store name columns and keep unique values, and remove empty values if we have any empty values in our new query. And what that's going to do, if I ask Copilot to actually do that, because we've seen that the store name is being repeated on the sales query, what Copilot will do will create a new query that will allow us to actually have unique values inside of that new query. And then we can be able to just remove any other empty values that are there or empty rows that are there. So you can see now it actually created a new query called query. And we have unique values of the commerce bicycle specialist, for an example, which was one of the ones that were duplicated there. So what I'm going to do here to make the job easier for Josh, I'm going to change the name and say Dimension Store or Theme Store, because as we are going to send this information or this data back into our lakehouse so that Josh can be able to use it in a notebook, he needs to have the right naming conventions for our tables because we're using a star schema. Okay, cool. We've seen how we can be able to use Copilot to actually create a new query on existing data, but how do we then create an entirely new query and add synthetic data with it? And the reason behind that is actually because we want to visualize our data based on the revenue generated on either a fiscal year, a quarter, or a calendar year, and so forth. So to do this, I'm going to quickly zoom out a little bit here on those queries and move this down. But to do this, firstly, yes, we're relying on Copilot, but we also have the option to do this ourselves. So how do we do this? We're going to select Enter Data at the top of our navigation bar, rename this column 1 to date key, for an example, then leave this as is, empty. We don't add any row of information. We're going to ask Copilot to help us with that. Select OK. This will then create a new query called query at the bottom, and we will have date key. For me, I'm going to rename it, so you can rename it here on the query settings pane. So I'm going to rename it and say dimension date, again, using a star schema with dimension tables and effect table. So I'm going to rename it to dimension date so that when we send it to our lakehouse, it has the right naming convention. Then the first step that we're going to do here is to actually generate that synthetic data that we were talking about. I have the option to actually add the synthetic data because I might be adding it, I might be making it up in my mind, but that may take me a very long time to actually add the synthetic data because I have to account for what's in my data set. So how do I do this? We ask Copilot. So I've already I've already started with the first step, but the rest of the steps now I'm going to rely on Copilot to actually do that for us. So I'm going to add a query here that says add a step to this query to add date values to the date key column. So being very specific, I like being specific, starting from the 1st of January 2012 to the 31st of December 2013. The reason why I'm doing this is because the number of orders in our sales table actually range from between those 2 years, 2013 and 2012. Right. So I asked Copilot to do that and I hit send. And then Copilot will be like, oh, there's something that you're trying to do. So I'm going to generate synthetic data for you. And if I expand this a little bit, you'll see that we have the synthetic data. We have the 1st of January 2012, and then it goes on and on till the 31st of January, and then starts to February, and then it goes on to the next year. So we have the synthetic data, but we're not going to stop there. You might notice something. We are actually storing date values in a string column type. So if we don't want that, again, I still have control within the data flow. So I can go onto the column, right click on it, change the data type and name it date. And then I can also rename the column name as well, again, and remove the one that we actually used, and then going to select rename, and then I'm just going to keep it as date. So now my data is being represented in an accurate manner because I'm storing date values in a date column. The next thing now with the synthetic data, we're going to play around with it because at the end of the day, we want to do visualizations that will actually give us information and tell a story about our data. The first thing is to actually try and split this into the day, the month, and the year, because other transformations are actually dependent on that. So to do that, I'm going to ask Copilot to actually allow us to do that. And then I'm going to say, hey, can you please add new columns, day, month, and year? And I'm not specifying anything else. And as I'm asking Copilot to do that, actually look at what happens. Copilot will be, in a sense, smart enough to say, hey, I'm going to give you the day from the date, which is, the 1st of January. The month is January. The year is 2012.
Yes.
So it knows that, okay, you want to create those new columns. These are the values that I'm going to store as I'm splitting your synthetic data. Then the next thing, since we have the synthetic data, which is what me and Josh were scratching our heads over, is how do we then, as we're trying to create this visualization in our mind, on how do we then look at the sales revenue that was generated over a fiscal year? So comparing previous fiscal year and the current fiscal year. And this one has a chunky prompt, if I may say, which I'll put on the screen right now. And I'm just going to ask Copilot to do that. But it says here, add 1 to the year column if the date, for an example, if the date month is greater than or equal to 7. So if you have your fiscal year starting in July, then you say, hey, on the year column, add 1 and keep it as is if the date month is less than or equal to 6. So that means if it's June, May, or any previous months, for an example, it will stay in that current fiscal year. Then we took it a step further and actually refined that prompt and say, hey, can you store the result in a new column called fiscal year and take the last 2 digits of that result? So if it's 2012 or 2013, take 1, 3 and combine them with the prefix FY. So you will have like FY13, FY12, for an example. So if you can see now, since Copilot has finished processing our prompt, you can see we have a new column called fiscal year with the desired output. And if I scroll quickly and I try to find July for the fiscal year, you'll find that it actually did that. It actually gave us and said, okay, our new fiscal year starts in July, so we'll have FY13 in that case. Then if we want to slice our data further and we want to slice our visualization further based on quarter, then we can also do the same thing in adding a column for quarter. And even that is also a chunky prompt because we were trying to calculate it on the side, but also we're trying to not do the calculations ourselves and try to use natural language to actually do that. What we found, as I'm going to send this to Copilot, what we found, if we just said, hey, add a column quarter, and we left it at that, what was going to happen is that Copilot was going to add that column for you called quarter, but it will base it based on the calendar year and not your fiscal year. So if your calendar year starts in the 1st of January 2012, your Q1 would start in January. But your fiscal year starts in July, so your Q1 means that it starts in July. So our prompt here said, add a column quarter with the values as Q1 when the month is equal to 7, July, or August, or May, being very specific to actually get the desired outputs. Q2 when the month is equal to, August, September, October, and so forth. And that actually gave us this result of having, all of those values being generated by Copilot with our synthetic data and actually saying, okay, here's what's happening here. This is your Q3, and you'll see when you go to April, for an example, you'll say, okay, this is the start of your Q4. And basically, that's actually how you can actually use Copilot within Data Factory to add synthetic data onto your query, whether it's a new query or an existing query. But in our case, we actually created a new query and we got synthetic data. So now we can be able to use this new query as a table in our lakehouse or as a table in our Power BI report as we're trying to slice and dice our data and building visualizations with it.
I think this is fascinating because just this topic of synthetic data is the scary sounding topic, right? It's like, oh, how do you do that? First, how do you get it into your data store? How do you do that easily without being some sort of an expert? But I love that you've got an albeit chunky query. It is a query that is reproducible. And once you create a query like this, you stash that and you can use variants of this going forward to kind of fill in the gaps of your data. So you can say like, hey, we don't have enough data looking at, 3 Decembers ago, but we can extrapolate some information just given last December or, something like this. Yeah. So yeah, this is great. And for retail, this is everything, right? Because retail is not an exact science. It just isn't, because you're not looking at someone's medical data or anything like that. You're looking at general trends in the market and general, preferences on SKUs, like people like red bicycles more in December versus yellow bicycles in summer, whatever it is. So I think this is incredibly cool. Oh, Someleze, you have given my brain like a fabulous exercise session today. So thank you so much for spending all this time with us. And everyone, please go back and carefully watch these 2 episodes and write stuff down, because next time, Josh is going to come and join us to teach us how to use Copilot in Azure Data Science and Copilot in Azure Data Engineering. So things are going to get way more technical. So get really familiar with how these tools work, because at the end of this 5-part series, you are going to be very, very proficient in Copilot in Azure Data. All right, till next time. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Someleze. Talk soon.
Thank you so much, Dona.